Thanks, Meher, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session on designing consent right strategy, architecture, and pitfalls to avoid, hosted by ConsenPro. My name is Mohit Raisinghani, and I will be moderating today's conversation. ConsenPro is a DPDP compliance platform from the CAMS group, and we spend a lot of time thinking about exactly what we are going to discuss today. Consent has moved from a compliance checkbox to a business critical control layer. And with the DPDP rules now notified, the question is no longer whether you take consent. It is whether it is defensible, scalable, and respected downstream. That is the conversation we want to have today. We have three practitioners in the room with us who have lived this problem across consulting, in-house DPO work, and regulatory advisory. We will cover strategy, architecture, and the pitfalls that trip up even well-intentioned teams. But before we start, a couple of things. We will be putting up a live poll. Meher, if you can put that across. This is to get a sense of where the audience is with regards to their DPDP journey. And accordingly, we can tailor some of the discussions as we go along. And number two, a friendly reminder to put your questions into the chat as and when they come to your mind. You don't have to wait till the end to ask your questions. Just pop them in the chat when it comes to your mind, and we will try to answer as many as we can. Okay, let me quickly introduce the panel before we look at the poll results. So I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and also tell us what consent means in their current function. Starting with Abhishek Tiwari, who is an associate director at PwC India. He's a globally certified privacy professional, and he's got so many certifications that I can't even pronounce all of them. So Abhishek, over to you.
Thank you, Mohit. And one of the good introductions, I would say, short and crisp for me. Thank you very much for the same. I'll not take much of time. So the name you guys know, I work with PwC as an associate director, takes care of the data privacy and protection. In my day-to-day job itself, I would say, deal with different accounts and clients where, we advise them how consent management is very important in the journey. So for me, I would say consent management is the first step of any journey where we start in terms of dealing with people, taking care of their personal data. So consent is the first step for me, right? So thank you, and a pleasure to be here, and happy to interact with the fellow panelists and all of you.
Thanks, Abhishek. Next, Grishmi Koka. Grishmi is an associate data protection officer for APAC in the Global Privacy Office at Franklin Templeton. A CIPI certified professional working at the intersection of regulatory compliance, operational privacy, and business enablement. She is a Data Protection Leadership Award recipient. Grishmi, if you can go ahead and tell us what consent means and give us a short intro as well.
Thank you, Mohit, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. This is Grishmi. As Mohit said, I work as Associate Data Protection Officer for Franklin Templeton. So my current day-to-day activities mostly leads for managing privacy program for Franklin in and across APAC region, including India. So I'm currently working on a specialized privacy program for Franklin, including DPDP implementation in India. Right now, consent on the first thought, consent generally seemed what I remember from DPDP lens is the 23 language requirement, which is baffling to everyone. But apart from that, in simple terms, consent means it is as a right of giving a right to an individual to decide how their personal data to be processed. So we as entities, we are giving rights to our customers, to individuals, to decide how their personal data can be processed. In simple terms, we can define consent as that.
Thanks, Grishmi. And finally, Priyank Kumar. Priyank is Chief Privacy Officer at DPDP Consultants and also the co-founder of GDPR Consultants, bringing more than 15 years of experience across IT, data security, and privacy consulting. His specialization is privacy advisory, GDPR, and DPDP compliance. Priyank, over to you.
Thank you, Mohit. Everyone, my name is Priyank, and like Mohit introduced, I am the Chief Privacy Officer and also the CEO at DPDP Consultants. For me, consent means everything. Now you can see the transition that I had in my life, right? From GDPR, several legal bases. I do miss the contract and legitimate interest, by the way, coming to a DPDP framework, which made the consent at the top of its fulcrum. So consent is the king, we used to hear. But what we have seen this practically realized in the DPDP, where it becomes the major legal basis. On a day-to-day basis, I advise our customers in terms of designing their DPDP journey, in terms of orchestrating their consent framework, establishing it, executing it, and moving all the consents from from preaching to practice. So that's what a usual day is about me when it comes to consent.
Thank you, Priyank. Thank you. That's a strong room that we have there. Before we actually move on and I start asking my first questions, a quick sense of the poll, right? I think more than or roughly 50% of the audience is polling in that they've just started the initial assessment on DPDP compliance, which is pretty much what we are also seeing when we are talking to clients. Almost everyone is trying to sort of make sense of this, trying to figure out how to implement. Very few are actually committed to it in or sort of at a very advanced level. Anyway, so Abhishek, let me start with you. From what you are seeing across enterprises, where are organizations getting consent strategy fundamentally wrong? Is it the interpretation, the ownership, or the execution?
So, I would say, Mohit, it's not just one issue. They're not getting the consent wrong just because of one issue. See, the real problem here is doing a misalignment between the interpretation, ownership, and then execution, I would say. So the first, I would say, the single biggest root cause is a misinterpretation. So many people are, I would say, when I say people in the sense, many enterprises, they are still thinking consent, just a tick box exercise. We will demonstrate that we are collecting. How we are collecting, where we are collecting does not matter. We just have to do a tick box and say we are doing these things, and they are not getting into that actual implementation and understanding that point. And because of this misreading, consent is being overused, it is misapplied, it is collected in a way that actually don't stand up for a regulatory scrutiny itself, right? And what result it gives to us? It gives a result to us for an invalid consent, and also very, very important is an erosion of user trust. Then the second, I would say the root cause is an ownership point. So actually, if I can say it very frankly, the consent sits on no man's land. The marketing team, they owns a user experience. Legal team, they owns a wording. IT teams, they own a system. Product team, they owns the journey. But who owns the consent or who owns the end-to-end consent lifecycle? It's a no man's land, right? So because of, a clear accountability, a preference management, or at least an auditability, because of missing of all those things, in short, the ownership is missing. So the first one, I'll say the misinterpretation. The second one goes for ownership, and the last one goes for execution itself. Because when the interpretation is very wrong, there is no ownership, then you can imagine how the execution will go. It will go into multiple directions. People will do, I would say consent implementation at each level. And I've seen certain organizations where consent management was happening into many business departments. And I got worried that, okay, you're collecting consent, which is totally okay, but you're implementing at different verticals. That means, are you going to take 6, 7 tools? One tool is different for one department, one tool is different for other department, and no one is talking to each other. So, that becomes very, very challenging, I would say.
Yep, thanks. Very succinct observations, Abhishek. Grishmi, you are sitting inside a large financial institution yourself. From an in-house DPO lens, how do you balance the regulatory purity of consent with the business friction, that you will inevitably encounter in customer journeys?
Yeah. So the real question is, how we respect for lost demand for using consent into the customer journey without giving them like a maze of notices pops up and drops out, and making their lives miserable. So the act itself recognizes intention. So there is a regulatory purity, but it is not as same as regulatory effectiveness. The consent architecture, it theoretically it is perfect. The act, how it clearly describes as consent in theoretical ways, it is perfect. But practically, if in readable, it has its coercive effects. If not implemented correctly, it can disrupt the customer's onboarding journey, which can in words lead to customers abandoning the onboarding journey, which which might have failed both in from law perspective as well as the business perspective. So what here we need to look forward is pushing consent more meaningfully towards transparency rather than making it just a paperwork. So how do we balance it? I think the first step that we should do is we should stop using consent as the universal solvent. So we do have other ways of processing personal data. We have legitimate uses, we have other uses under DPDP law. We have to create a critical design feature where we have to carefully map which process requires consent and which uh, doesn't require. So if we keep on, overloading the customers with consents, and not differentiate the avoidable consent asked with the unavoidable consent asked, we will create a consent fatigue, which can create a credibility issue for the consents. So what truly matters is how we have to start seeing consent in the lens. So for that, what we have to do is we must separate what's a must for have service from a nice to have processing of service of information of personal data. For example, let's say for onboarding and servicing, we for onboarding we need we need customers mobile number, pan, KYC details, nominee information. For opening an account, which is like a must for have service for personal information, where we can use other modes as a legal basis, where if we plan to use personal data for advertising, marketing, analytics, then which is considered as a nice to have uh, data,
Or an optional
uh,
thing.
optional data, where we can use consent as an option. So making this differentiation between the use of personal data matters the most, uh, which
Yes.
practically comes down to purpose limitation. Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Rishmi. I think that's really good perspective that you brought in there. Priyank, I'll come to you now. Under the DPDP framework, what actually separates legally valid consent from what you would call truly defensible consent, specifically at the time of an audit or a dispute?
That's a great question, Mohit. And this is what we've been experiencing. When an organization is trying to set up the consent management framework, the first intent is to make it a legally aligned framework and then make it a defensible framework. But what we have seen in a lot of organizations, nothing exists. Now, when you look at the legal framework of the consent, we'll probably just have to refer to the Gazette or the rules that has really outlined the high level principles of consent. Consent has to be free, unambiguous, informed, no, well informed, or consent has to be easy to withdraw as is to give. Now, these are the legally framework of the consent, but they are not enough for a defense. Now, when actually as you're part of the litigation or you're part of the audit, there is much more that you have to produce rather than what the legally framework says. If I just say consent has to be free, the defensible part of that will be to prove there was no coercion. If they say the consent was informed, the defensible part of that will be to prove that there was an information given. There has to be a notice and the consent linkage, which has to be proved as a part of the defense. If says consent is not forever, they have to be defensible argument around what is the validity of the consent. If they say consent is easy to withdraw, there has to be, I need to present from a defensible argument that how easy it was. Did I really have to route it to a DPO at abc.com, or did I really had a one click take my data back, something like that? Now, consent has already been taken, but defensible would be how have you taken this for the processing activities or for the children data? There is a larger requirement of processing children data on the verifiable parental consent. So while the consent looks like a pretty much an overarching umbrella term that your consent has to be easy or consent has to be served with a notice, when it comes to the defensibility of this consent, there are multiple parameters that we need to factor in. How did we take the consent? What all channels did we take? What about the legacy data that we're talking about, which actually right now people are sweeping under the rug, thinking about the DPDP only applies on the fresh data collections. How about the children data? How your consent is specific? How are you bundling them? Is your consent becoming a part of your invisible TNC that everybody comes and tick boxes like Abhishek mentioned? And at the same time, I do agree with Grishmi also about the consent fatigue that we definitely have to rule out. But the fact is, invisible processing is something that absolutely need to be negated in this entire consent management framework. And that's where the defensible thing has to come. The validity of the consent, the record of the consent, the notice of such consent, the proof that you have taken a consent, the proof that the user is aware. We talk about affirmative action of a user as one of the legally binding provisions of the consent, but what exactly is an affirmative action? Have we verified? Is the verification of that consent? Have I given consent on behalf of Abhishek? Is there a verification methodology? Is there a traceability? Is there an audit log that can say that maybe I've given a consent today, opted it out, and then again has given it to you? So there are multiple defensible, when I say is artifact of consent granulated into different provision of legality is what will become the defensible consent, in my opinion.
Yes, very good perspective. Thanks, Priyank. I think let me just try to pull together what I'm hearing. There are like three threads sort of running through this discussion. The first, as Abhishek mentioned, is the ownership gap, right? The no man's land analogy. Consent, when it works, is owned by someone who sits at the intersection of legal, product, tech, operations. But when it doesn't work, it's owned by legal on paper and nobody in practice. I think that's what Abhishek was basically alluding to. But the regulatory interpretation is clear. Failure is almost never in understanding the law. It is in deciding who inside the organization is actually responsible for the last mile. The second thread, I think, which I would probably call the design mismatch. Consent is designed for the moment of collection. What does the notice say is like a tick box exercise, as someone mentioned. Does the user opt in? Is the language available in the specified languages? But the accountability to DPDP obligations do not stop at collection. They extend to withdrawal, to grievance redressal, to data erasure, to audit trails. And we need to produce all of these things, which is what Priyank was mentioning, that how to actually make it defensible. So most consent frameworks that we are seeing are actually designed for capture, but not necessarily for defensibility. The third thread is the business friction that Grishmi raised, which is real and it's not going away. Question is not whether friction exists. Friction will exist, but I think how do you sort of design the friction in such a way deliberately so that it doesn't lead to consent fatigue and leads to probably a better user experience as well. So what I'm taking back from this block is consent strategy fails most often not because organizations misread the regulation. Almost everybody understands that. It fails because no one owns it end to end, because it was designed for collection, not for accountability, and because the business friction it introduces was never treated as a design problem worth solving. Let us go under the hood on the consent architecture bit a little bit. I want to put this to all three of you. If you were designing a consent architecture from scratch today, what are the 2 or 3 non-negotiables across systems, data flows, and auditability? Abhishek, why don't you start us off, and then maybe Grishmi, and then Priyank?
So, I'll take, I would say, some words and statements from, Priyank's, what Priyank was explaining just one time before itself. So, 3 things which I'll consider is, that consent should be enforceable. It's just not collected, just not a tick box behavior, I would say, right? And the defensibility is also very, very important, a real-time audit trail, so that, we are able to check whether what we have deployed is actually working on the ground or not. We should not be, going after a year back and then say, oh, what we have done so far has not worked. So a regular, I would say, checks is important. And the last one is to have a traceability in terms of end to end. It should not stop, in terms of collection. Till the end itself, we should go and check. So the traceability should be there from end to end, right? So these are, I would say, pointers from my side. And I'm happy to hear my panelist.
Thanks. Krishmi, if you can go next.
Yes. I absolutely agree with the traceability from end-to-end opinion by Abhishek. But along with that, what I would prefer is that under the DPDP Act, it clearly says that on withdrawal of consent, it says that once the consent is withdrawn, the personal data must be erased until retention is applied. So this means we will also have to work on a back end on retention and deletion timelines and framework. The architecture maybe must work or map data lineage in such a way that when a withdrawal of consent flows, it automatically triggers deletion or an irreversible anonymization across internal systems, like through processors or backups where feasible, while capturing the exceptions under the legal retention applies. So I think this is a very difficult but inherently necessary thing that every business must, work through, uh, have worked through, like set up frame lines for deletion while also thinking on withdrawal together. Yeah, these both. Maybe that's what I
Thanks,
would do
Krishmi.
start from.
Yes. What about you, Priyank? 2 or 3 non-negotiables.
And I'll tell you, right, I'm reporting from the war zone. I'm actually on the ground where I'm deploying consent management as a framework, as a product also. There's a headless chicken race about everybody wants to be compliant and everybody wants to have consent management deployed. But the bigger question is what we get every day is, do we need a consent in this? Do we need a consent in that? Why do we need a consent? If you consent management platforms or the tools are not plug and play solutions that you just plug in the USB drive and you start the show. The first thing that organization is missing before they actually deploy the product is, have they understood their business, the flows of the PII coming in, why a certain PII is coming in, what are the certain business. That identification is a prerequisite of deploying a consent management framework, and that is absolutely non-negotiable for me because I deploy consent management platform. People say, we want your consent management platform, how many licenses? These are the applications. And I say, why are you collecting the personal data? Okay, I'll check with my marketing team. So that groundwork has not been established. It's almost like you getting a nice refrigerator in your house without having an electricity supply. So let's do that groundwork is the first thing. I understand the business context on what personal data is collected and why before you actually deploy a consent management. And second, as I said, it will be a little reiterative, but we definitely want to focus on the recording of such consent. A user will forget. The user have short memories. And I always give an example that today I will give you a consent, tomorrow I get too many messages, I'll opt out. Maybe day after tomorrow I again get a little interest. Fourth day I apply in your same organization as a candidate. And fifth day I get signed up on your platform and then I opt out. Now look at the transactions I've done with you. Few years later, I'll forget that, but your consent management platform will remember that. So if you're not training our platform to have, a memory of all the transactions that we have done, the traceability that what Abhishek was also mentioning, that's very critical for me. Understanding of the business, traceability of all the consent are two non-negotiable thing for me before we actually go and create that state-of-art system that a lot of organizations are trying to create.
Absolutely, Priyanka. I don't think I could agree with you more on that because we're seeing these in many of our client interactions as well. You give a demo to a client and they want to know how much are you going to sell this to me for without actually giving any more information, right? So I don't think it's being taken in the strategic sense that this is meant to be deployed. It's being deployed more like, let's just implement this tool.
Because the majority, and let's agree, majority of our, who are consuming consent management platform are used to consuming applications. They know a certain, if I install this amount of firewall, this will do something. If I install a DLP, this will do something. They have particular purpose. It will sit on the endpoint. It will antivirus or servers. This is a little different because it does not specify to a single domain or a single application or a single endpoint. It is a cross organizational effort. And that kind of cross functional thing is something which is relatively that even I believe organizations are exploring. And that's why you and I have a kindred spirits in terms of experiencing market.
Yes. So Abhishek, coming to you, do you think enterprises are underestimating the complexity of consent orchestration across systems like CRMs, loan origination systems, analytics platforms, third-party vendors? Where do things typically break in a multi-structured architecture like this?
Yes, they are very much, underestimating the complexity that how the consent orchestration, works across the system itself. And, I'll tell you what actually happens, So first problem that I have observed is there is no single source of truth. You go to different databases, they are telling a different truth story. Sometimes the data is being collected in a main, I would say, system. It is flowing down to downstream systems, and there is no single database which will tell you the single source of truth. That is the, I would say, clear-cut challenge, which I'm seeing. And, there are certain also execution gaps which are hidden inside the data pipelines. So as we all know, the modern enterprises have got complex data flows. And many of the time, these pipelines, they don't check consent before they go for any kind of a processing. So, the data continuously, it keeps on moving, it keeps on transforming, even without a valid consent, or even, if the consent is being withdrawn, then also it keeps on flowing, I would say. So yes, I would say definitely they are underestimating the complexity. So what highly I would say that a single source of truth is very, very important, so that this flow, can be at least, I would say, managed somehow in a better manner.
Absolutely. I think Grishmi, coming to you, in a large organization like Franklin Templeton, right? How do you ensure consent is not just captured but also respected downstream across teams, partners, legacy systems which run in batch mode, so on and so forth?
Yes. So, firstly, for legacy systems, what I understand with the upcoming DPDP, legacy system needs compensating controls. Like not every legacy platform that we use can consume to modern consent signals, or can we work together to build a API which can work on managing consent. So the maybe the practical answer would be maybe not to wait much for the perfect transformation to capture the consent journey or to work with the consent journey for the legacy systems. But right now introduce like a control points where if the system can technically honor consent, they can be allowed to operate outside, like have a monitored control wrapper where at least right now, as a temporary base, you can reduce risk while the modernization of consent or using controlling consent through legacy system catches up. And secondly, uh, how across teams, what I feel is that privacy and especially consent is not a one man program. It's neither a privacy team's responsibility nor a tech team's responsibility. A strong governance needs to be anchored for clear ownership of business units, like how Abhishek said, nobody's willing to take a responsibility for consent. It's like a no man's land.
Yeah.
But how we can build a clear ownership for each and every business units, like have building a RSI chart for each and every unit across systems, where you can clearly hand who will be handling the personal data usage, who will be handling the consent, how the system flows, who will be responsible, accountable, control, and implementing. So each business owner, you can implement a policy and procedure where you can help each business owner for that particular business unit accountable for using that data for that specific purpose within the consent journey, and make each and every team responsible for using and handling the personal data uh, for whatever purposes that they intend to. And finally, all of this wouldn't be possible without training. Uh, it is important for our teams internally to help them understand what privacy is, how consent works, how consent clearly works under DPDP Act, what the consent journey is, and it is not a and the training should also not be like a one size fit in for the whole of company. It it should it should be a specific business unit based training where uh, for like let's say for business teams we need to understand the business, a training should be given on usage boundaries. For vendor managers, a training should be given on how uh, interaction between controllers and
Segregated by function,
processes,
basically.
yeah,
Something
segregated by
separate for
function.
InfoSec, something different for
Yes.
compliance, for
Yes,
policy, so on
very
and so
true,
forth. Yeah.
very true. Yeah, and that is very essential. I think every company should do have this training sessions before May 2027. Uh, this will really help them internally. Everybody will
Makes
have
sense.
some idea before DPDPA comes in effect.
Makes sense. Priyank, one question for you. What role do you think consent managers and frameworks like Account Aggregator play in this, right? Are they simplifying consent architecture or are they adding new layers of complexity? We've seen a lot of parallels between, say, consent managers and the AA framework, Account Aggregator framework. So, with keeping that in mind.
Whoever wrote the DPDP law was very fascinated with account aggregators. We can definitely see account aggregators being the brainchild when it comes to designing those typical examples that you see in the Gazette, talking about one bank can give this data to another bank is just because the user is requesting. That is a typical framework. What you see is in the FIP or FUP that you say in the financial industry. The one that requests the financial information, another one that provides it. And it's a great platform. There's no negotiating about this. And I think it is the reason why it's adding little complexity because it creates a tunnel vision only to look at the financial enterprises. What we have to understand while account aggregators have only taken care of the BFSI industry, there is a larger industry in terms of data fiduciaries. What about real estate? What about healthcare? What about manufacturing? And what about retail? How are you planning to use them all in a basis of an account aggregator model? Unless government comes along with something like an extended version of DigiLocker consent and expects every citizen to onboard on it, that's a different story. There's a lot of complexity around AA infrastructure. Account aggregators are perfect. And I mean, it's helping me to secure a loan because there is another financial information that I can get it, but it doesn't help me to buy groceries or it doesn't help me to get into one of the healthcare. I know Abha is another platform that they are trying to do this
Yep.
with in care, but there are fragmentations. What is interesting during my discussions with my customer that we get to do, consent manager is it can wash their hands clean of this for a lot of reasons from non-compliance perspective. If the burden of proof of compliance lies with the data fiduciary,
Fiduciary.
it's not the consent manager who's going to be penalized, it's the data fiduciary is going to be penalized. Now you have another third party bringing into an ecosystem just for consent router, I would say, rather than a consent manager, because they, as per the law, they cannot see the data. They are all blindfolded, routing consent here and there. They cannot see the data. They cannot be penalized. The burden of proof still lies with the data fiduciary. And if a consent manager gets deregistered tomorrow, goes broke, suffers a breach, vanishes in thin air, what happens to the consent collected so far? So there are bigger questions, and that is why if you see how industry is reacting and behaving right now, a majority of the organization taking into cognizance of the burden of proof that I've just mentioned have started doing the consent management themselves. It's my data principal, it's my processing, I will take the consent. So while AA is a good example, and I would say it's a good somebody had AA in mind when they developed this, but between the regulatory clarity and the implementation execution, there is a large gap, I would say. How many of us do we understand the AA concept as a data principle? But
Yeah.
we definitely know when we go on a website, keep my data that we, okay, this, and I have Amazon has taken my consent or this one has taken my consent. So I would rather say it is adding a complexity and a complexity that is very difficult to decipher at this moment.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So let me quickly summarize this section. So I think many organizations are effectively underestimating the consent architecture and the chops, technical as well as organizational training, etc., that it will take to implement this in the true sense. You can have a well-designed consent capture flow, a clean notice, properly unbundled purpose structure. And it's still possible that after all this, some downstream system, some offline system does not read it, or it does not reach an analytics pipeline that was built many years ago. But the consent was taken. So the architecture did not honor it, right? So all these are real situations that we'll end up dealing with. I think what Grishmi described inside Franklin Templeton is probably the hardest problem, right? Consent governance across a large organization is an organizational problem as much as it is a technical problem, right? It's got a training aspect to it. It's got an accountability aspect to it. It's not that everything happens as a system. You also need the right sort of processes, the right sort of mindsets, the right sort of training to ensure that everything works together like clockwork. And Priyank's point on consent managers and account aggregators is also worth noting. In our sort of exuberance, we tend to sort of forget that account aggregator works only for BFSI, and it actually a very small portion of people in India are probably familiar with it as well. So these frameworks can probably help to shift the complexity, but they don't eliminate the complexity as such. Interesting thoughts. So to summarize, I think consent architecture is only as strong as its weakest downstream link. Orchestration, getting the signal from point of capture to every system that acts on data is even where mature implementations might fracture. And with that in mind, let us talk about what failure actually looks like in practice. So Abhishek, give us one looks compliant but is not pattern that you've seen repeatedly in some of your implementations. The kind of thing that passes an internal review but may not survive a regulatory scrutiny.
Did you got to know that I faced this issue? It seems you read my mind. So, I'll, first of all, I'll tell how it looks like, and then I'll say, how I face this issue. So, what I'll say, the pattern here is, collecting a valid consent at the front door, but then never enforcing it in the back end. So on the surface, when you'll go to any, I would say, user interaction websites or mobile apps, the user interface shows very nicely that how clearly you can opt out or how clearly you can opt in that place itself. Very neat and clean manner, very sophisticated, very nice language. And when you opt in terms of when you choose an option that I should not be I'm not okay in terms of getting these things collected and I'm not giving my consent itself. So then in the backend itself, the data still flows into the CRM. It still goes to the analytics tool. It still goes to the third-party systems, regardless of what you have chosen or not. So it is just a very clean UI, which gives you a very comfort that, okay, see, we are compliant, but in the backend, it is not happening. And the reason I was saying in the start itself, because I myself have, faced this issue that I received some random SMS. It has an option of stop and unsubscribe. I do it. And I get an acknowledgement that, sorry, we are very sad, you're leaving us, please come back. Next day, again, they send SMS. Again, I unsubscribe, it comes back again. So I don't understand whether are they missing me so much that they, totally avoid my consent withdrawal and comes back to me. So this is a very, very clear case, example that how in the front door, you are saying that, okay, you do have everything in place, but in the back end, nothing is happening.
Absolutely. This sort of reminds me of this famous song called Hotel California by this band called the Eagles. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Yeah.
True.
But so Grishmi, coming to you, where do internal teams most often bypass or dilute consent? Is it product, marketing, ops, intentionally or unintentionally?
Yeah, this is a very tricky question. Maybe I shouldn't blame my teams, but uh, what generally happens is that when a consent is collected, each particular consent is technically tied to its specific purpose. And when systems, when an internal systems are not actively placed where on compatibility on and of use of such data, there are some intentional or unintentional chances where uh, such data can, which an individual might have opt in or opt out for, may be reused for any other incompatible purpose, even internally. Uh, so suppose if in case any new case of use arises for this same particular personal data, where it's generally required that as in a consent architecture, we require a fresh consent. But what internal teams try to do is give us a retrospective justification on why to use this personal data rather of asking or taking of consent or using any other justified legal basis. So this is one of the reasons. And other one, when talked about, like it's already said about, is at the withdrawal of consent. So at the point of withdrawal, uh, like I said earlier, the DPDP triggers for action on deletion of personal data until retention is required. So if for any reason consent is relied as a legal basis for that particular use of personal data, uh, we must actually make sure that it is and critical that we have defensible mechanism to use that personal data even after which have that personal data within our systems even after withdrawal of consent with a justifiable uh, reason and an internal mechanism that can only be possible through drafting and a reliable retention policy. Uh, Mostly what team tries to do is on an architecture base, they do withdraw the consent, all the withdrawals happen. Maybe I might not, like how Abhishek said, they might, when we unsubscribe to data, there are chances. Mostly, we might not, we get repeated marketing mails, but there are sometimes we do get stopped the marketing mails. But
Sure.
what the law says is that to also delete the personal data of that customer, which internally the teams, marketing teams might not really agree to.
Yeah.
So they should provide a legal justification for why do they want to use that personal data and should have a definable mechanism for retaining that personal data.
Absolutely. I think
So
more
these
so now because now there are fiduciary responsibilities that come with these compliances, right? I think with DPDPA coming in and actually notifying fines for various issues. Thanks, Rishmi, for
Yes.
that perspective. Priyank, let me end this block with a direct question. If a regulator or the DPP asks for proof of consent tomorrow, what are the top gaps that would be exposed in a typical organization from your experience?
Question. I refer back this to the question you asked, Abhishek, that what looks compliant but is not compliant. And I
Yeah.
think that is where I would start. I would say organizations are trying to look compliant, and that is why when they, why they want to be a comprehensive compliance, they land into a cosmetic compliance. They want to they preach a lot on those privacy notices, which apparently acts like a paper tiger, but it doesn't roar and doesn't translate into a practice, right? Interesting, like it is a very relatable scenario that I had, like what Abhishek had around with unsubscription. In one of the websites, when I was getting a repeated calls from them, I said I would like to opt out, and the DPO suggested me, why don't you just go into a DNC, subscribe to a DNC? Now, DNC apparently means do not call. So I go there, key in my number and say DNC, it says agree to the terms and conditions. So I have a curious head. So I will just click on the terms and condition, and the terms of condition says by clicking this box, you allow our representative to call you.
Circular
So
reference error.
It's a circular reference.
By design.
So that is the TNC of your DNC has a problem. So that is the
That's
reason
a
why
feature, not a bug, I think.
and that is what I want to say. Try to preach more but practice less. And that is what I call as a cosmetic compliance. Now, to answer your question, what regulators would probably look at, and I think there's a lot of precedents that we can take from mature data protection bodies like ICO, or like CINL, like Ireland Data Protection Board, or wherever we have seen regulatory authorities conducting those forensic, giving sanctions to the organizations, what they have done so far, how they have treated. Now, data protection. Now, a lot of organizations currently think this is an ISO compliance. They think when we approach to them regarding DPDP compliance, they say, okay, you give me a certificate. They just want to hang it on the wall that, okay, next review after 1 year. That is not how it happens. It's a legal compliance, which means it allows you to be compliant every single day. So this is a major shift in the paradigm in terms of how organizations have been looking at compliance. So when a regulator will come, they will also understand you cannot turn an entire Indian market upside down within 12 months or 18 months they are given. But at this time, there will definitely be, regulator will be looking at the due diligence of a fiduciary, how much you have done. A great example happened in one of the advisory sessions within MITI when somebody said from the MITI, if I come to an organization and say, do you know that a user comes to a data protection board and say, I would like to complain against this XYZ organization. They are processing my data and it hits my right to privacy or whatever. I will ask certain questions. Do you recall when you gave the data? The user says no. It says, did you go out and raise your rights? I said there was nothing. There was an email address that was never returned. Is there a privacy notice on the website? They say, no, there is nothing. Is there a contact point you can reach out to? He says nothing. Then I'm going to pay the maximum penalties to those organizations. On the second hand, if I see and I go to a website where there is an interoperable channel, there is a grievance redressal mechanism where I put in the data, it clearly says I'm taking your consent. When I want to withdraw the consent, it gives me those mechanisms. The privacy which is embedded in the organization is visible. When I go to the data, it says I might have 10 lakh data principals, 8 lakhs are consented, 2 lakhs we're still working on. Oh, I know the deadline has been finished. I know there's a step they have taken. So I think regulator will definitely be looking at the due diligence that the organization has taken. It's almost like if you had a breach and you go and say we never had a antivirus or a firewall and the data was left out in the open unauthenticated versus an organization who had all the state of art security measures with encrypted data and the breach still happens. Yeah, we're still living in the world of Snowdens, as I always say, and anything can be hacked. But the due diligence is something that I think regulator will be very compassionate about looking at the organization. We'll talk about the digital trust, and the why organizations are trying to do this. Their stocks will tank and reputational damages that they might incur. In my opinion, regulators at this time will look at the public facing front, which gives that is the first thing. You can create a fortress inside, widen the moat inside your organization, hardly makes a difference to me, a simple data principal who's giving my data. This law is for citizens. If you're not able to satisfy me, if I'm not convinced that my data is being processed rightfully by your organization, you can create whatever wonders you want to create in the organization. I still have a DPBI to go and knock the door. So I think that is what regulators would be looking at, how you're giving that satisfaction, that assurance, that trust by being in that fiduciary position, which means trustee to those data principals who have submitted your data and what steps you have taken since the time law was enacted. We cannot go and say we have never read the gadget. 23 in August 23 it was already in August 23 it was already rolled out. We're sitting in 2026 and there's still a lot of deliberations that let May 27th come. So I think that will be the initial impression. I cannot speak for the board, but I think if we take a precedence from the mature board, this is how the future looks like to me.
Absolutely. I think the DPDP Act is not going to operate on just on some cosmetic implementations that have been done, but rather in terms of a comprehensive framework that an organization would have tried to implement across different touch points. They may or may not have been fully successful in doing it, but at least the intent needs to be in the right direction. They need to have the right sort of operational infrastructure, the right sort of organizational frameworks, the right sort of teams who are authorized and empowered to be able to, implement some of these changes. And while most organizations are right now at the sort of planning or thinking stage. They probably need to be at the implementation stage already. Fair points. I think what Abhishek, Grishmi, and Priyank have described today across three very different vantage points are all variations of the same underlying gap, right? That consent treated as a point in time event rather than a continuous obligation. The policy exists, but there is no necessary well-defined process to it. The more useful question for senior leadership now is not where you are failing today. It is what it actually looks like to get this right over the next 12 months or so. I would want to end this structured discussion with a forward look. So over the next 12 to 18 months, what will differentiate organizations that get consent right from those that continue to struggle? To each of you, right? Starting with Abhishek again.
So, I would say that organizations, who are treating consent as an infrastructure, they will lead, they will get successful. And those who will treat it just as a paperwork, it will just be a paper tiger and it will fall apart.
Thank you. Grishmi?
Yes, I agree with Abhishek as well, but adding, I think the real differentiator would be to create a transparent and a legally aligned consent mechanism, which helps us not to manage it centrally, but also manually downstream it, especially with legacy system analytics and process vendors, having a proper retention mechanism in place. Those organizations with who try to work on implement on this would really get to have DPDP compliance in a more smoother manner than the ones who don't.
Priyank, your view?
Opinion, I think the organization who have already got their consent right, they have much more flexibility to work on the after phase or the second phase, which is like integration of the consent management, the downstream systems. They are much more prepared for any regulatory changes that we say out of Section 40 and all others. They will be ready to implement them because they have actually done the groundwork, like I already mentioned. Organizations who are struggling right now, I think their struggle period is going to be far more longer because by the time there will be a new obligation of downstream system integrations, or there will be new, if tomorrow MITI comes and says, now I also want you to do this and that, they're still at the phase one. So they're running pretty much behind. So their deliberations and their procrastination around deploying the consent management is not helping them. It's actually they're making them way more, backwards than they should be. So there definitely will be a differentiator. Those organizations will find themselves step ahead of the other organizations.
That makes sense. So last question, right? One piece of advice for a CXO that you would have at this point, right? Just one to each of you, starting with Abhishek again.
So, probably what I can suggest is, building consent as a control plane, not just a feature, not just a compliance feature that, your every system, is asking for a permission, from your consent engines before it goes and touches the data itself. So this, I would say a single mindset, shift that you'll be doing, it will save the years of patchwork fixes that we perform, and it will make the entire data ecosystem a future proof and robust also. So having this consent as a control plane will really help, I would say.
Rishmi?
So I would say maybe treat consent not just like a UI or UX layer on any website, but rather than like a core decisioning infrastructure, and maybe build on defining well-defined policies and procedures around consent management, so that it just not works on externally, but also helps consent process integrate internally within systems across the organization.
Absolutely. Core decisioning infra, I think that's key. Yes. Priyank, last one for you.
My only advice for the CSO who are building a consent stack is, as I mentioned, first get a complete alignment of your business. And that's why concepts like ROPA and all that ever existed is please align your business, understand what your business needs, then design the consent management framework. There are plenty of consent management platforms out in the market. All of them have their own flavors. Understand what do they offer, how they integrate, make your public facing platform compliant first, because those are the platforms who directly integrate interact with the data principles. So if you're going to further delay it, there will be delays and delays and delays. So there is no option, it's an obligation, as I've always mentioned. DPDP is here, it's for real. We will not be, you should not be sitting after a year thinking, wish we could have started earlier. So my word to the CXOs is the clock is already ticking, it has already ticked half of the way. So half of it's already left. Start your compliance right now, right away.
Absolutely. I think thanks a lot. But let's take a few audience questions before we close. I think there are a few come into the chat. Let me just try to read out a few questions going in order. So this question is from Pranav. Since recommendation engines are built on historic user behavior, if a user withdraws consent later, what happens to the data already embedded in these models? Do we need to unlearn it or just stop future usage?
I have, attempted to give an answer to this in the chat, but let me do a repeat to Pranav. So, Pranav, the simple or short answer which I can give here, and definitely I'll, request Grishmi and Kumar also, Priyank also, to add their views here. So, the simple answer which I can say is delete the user level data that you have it up in place. Stop doing any personalization which is happening, and also, because doing these two things, that means deleting the data and doing stopping the personalization, because retraining the whole model is generally not at all required unless and until you cannot delete that personalization. Then probably it might be chance, or it might be required that you need to retrain your model. But I like my co-panelists also to share their view.
Yes.
That's why. No, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, Priya, please. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm saying this, I agree. You cannot unlearn what you have already learned. Even if you think you have learned, you will not. Because there's already a lot of data has gone inside your learning models, which is why the learning model is what it is day to day. So you don't want to do that. And then again, the entire purpose would be defeated. Maybe we, as a preemptive measures, we would not have used the PII to train the models. And when we talk about, you mentioned user behavior, that spans through to a lot of data that can be directly identified, which can become a PI, and the data that cannot be become a PI. So there could be, certain zip code or certain areas doing certain kind of transactional behavior. You can use your models to train that. But it's always a great idea to train your models on the non-PI or anonymized data. With me.
Absolutely. Makes
And
sense.
maybe let me just add it from law perspective. So what the act clearly says that for withdrawal of consent, if suppose that individual tries to practice his consent on withdrawal of processing his data, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have deleted the previous systems or need to unlearn anything. You just need to stop processing the user for their personal data going further in the future usage. So there is no requirement to need to like unlearn systems or work on anything else from a law perspective. That's
Correct.
how the act says.
Sure. Thanks for weighing in on that. I think we have an interesting question here, which is not specific to an entity or a specific challenge, right? But it's more from a user perspective and probably from an ecosystem perspective. So the question is like this: a citizen would have given multiple consents in various different transactional places, right? Finance, real estate, shopping, restaurants, etc. So as a user, how can all the consents be viewed in one platform? Uh, since there would be different consent managers used by different data fiduciaries. So any thoughts on how this ecosystem can be sort of, brought together to work for the end user? Maybe Priyank, if you can start off. You're on mute.
No, am I audible now?
Yeah, good.
Yeah. I say that's a utopia as of now. That you will have one platform dealing with 100 of consent. Short answer to your question is open your phone and see how many apps do you use. Wish there was one app that would have taken care of everything. So that is not going to be there. Of course, as a data principal, as an individual, we interact with different platforms. Now, even if there is an account aggregator, we still have different banks doing different applications for us, different providing different services. So while there is a vision of having one platform with different user consent, and or also because they are having concept about consent fatigue and all that, I think that is not possible. So what is possible is understanding the nature of our relationship with data fiduciaries that we exercise, and whenever we know, there are unsolicited messages coming to you every day, or probably the ones that you've already subscribed, know what you need and know what you need. Because see, merely say withdrawal all will just cut me off from all the product and services and marketing offers that we get. So I think it's a user and a data principal due diligence and prudence in terms of what kind of consent he would like data fiduciary to continue and what are the ones he would like to get away with. It cannot be a one plug that you pull the plug and everything stops working. That might not even work in practicality and reality.
Makes sense. Abhishek, your view?
No, I totally agree with Priyank's answer here. Totally go on his view.
So no one ring to rule them all.
Not at all. There's no silver bullet here, right? That you use that option and then you'll unsubscribe, then you have peace of mind. It cannot happen.
Okay. Do you agree with that, Krishna?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think, I think no law has, so bundle consent is like a very utopian concept, how Priyank said. And in my personal opinion, considering the ecosystem in India and the awareness of consent from people, how many people would opt in to use consent manager is also a very big question in place. How many people would practically would like, a consent manager to manage their consents, like having an all-in-one solution. Uh, it's just only time would tell. Yeah.
Sorry, maybe time for one last question before we close, right? How should MSMEs, startups, and MNCs approach consent architecture given their vastly different resources and data maturity levels? I think if you can answer this specifically from the context of MSMEs and startups, because DPDP Act, the way it is, it covers almost everyone who processes data, right? Which is everything from a 10-person company to a 10,000 or a 5 lakh person company. So your views on that, especially for the MSME startup fraternity. Priyank, would you like to start?
Good question. The MSMEs cannot always hide behind the fact that we are a startup or we don't have resources. This law typically does not differentiate between the amount of revenue that you generate because you're an MSME or you are a Fortune 500. I could be a 4-member startup team managing a 10 million data principals, or I could be a $4 billion firm, which is completely a B2G firm. So the impact of this law is typically depending on the nature and the quantum of data that you process as a fiduciary. Now, MSME definitely have certain exemptions, and we enjoy certain exemptions. There are DPIIT exemptions on them. There are ATAIC that we can apply, and there are a lot of other exemptions that they apply. But please, this law has not exempted you from these obligations. As an MSME, I will still pay taxes. I'll still have to file for GST. I'll still have to do the other statutory obligations. And why not DPDP? Another part of this that somebody already mentioned, that startups are being exempted from DPDP because the resources and all others. Just please understand, these startups are the only startups who are also struggling to get further business, because trust me, being a data protection company, when I sign a SOW with my customer, the first thing they send it to me is vendor risk assessment and data protection agreements. Right? Eventually, it's my job to advise them on data protection agreements, but we get it from them. So startups are not getting it. There are tenders that are coming in where there's a requirement that the vendor has to be a data protection compliant company. So there is technically no exemptions, but yes, the scale of execution is definitely something we can take into considerations. Take your first step. What do you need? Look at the gadget. What do you first need? At least you need to have the consent there, the rights there, the right set of policies there, And very, smartly, the law has never said that go and establish the state-of-art infrastructure in your organization. The word they use is reasonable technical safeguards. And the word reasonable, they have left it to interpretation. What is reasonable to you might not be reasonable for MSME. I can just work with a normal DLP that ensures my data is protected rather than an organization who have 2 million employees sitting across all the part of the world connected to thousands of VPNs and layers and additional cloud providers. So at least I would say from the MSME, do not use it as a scapegoat. Maybe even if you escape the regulatory lens, you still have your customer who would not give you business if you're not compliant. So I think the first step you need to do is, like you have reasonable security safeguards, go with reasonable privacy safeguards. Evaluate your business. There are modules available for smaller organizations. Train your people. Which SME cannot train their people for that matter? That's a 1 hour job, do it. So just let's not look for a blanket exemption from this law, but evaluate your business and take the step which you believe reasonable helps you at least to fill those vendor risk assessment questionnaire when your clients throws at it. And of course, it's going to save you somewhere from the regulatory lens as well. That's my 2 cents.
Makes sense.
And I totally, echo on Priyank's view here. Sometimes we start looking out for exemptions, and that's not a right foot that we start, any journey with. So the right foot will be, to understand what data we are sitting into, how, we can go ahead and make sure that we are understanding what data we are sitting into, what controls will be applicable to us, because we have to look from that lens. Okay, this act is here or this regulation is here to give me more power to move forward. These are the brakes which will enable you to go on more higher speed. Do not think this, that this is a speed breaker or this is a blocker which will block my business. This is actually a brakes which is given to you so that you can go on more speed, bring in more business, bring in more trust, right? So if we start in that footing note, it will be very easy and very, very much, echo in terms of what Priyank mentioned, that start understanding about the reasonable privacy controls which might get applicable to me, instead of, thinking of whole suit and then getting worried that, okay, what I have to do. And still, if we still, after looking, we still think that, okay, this is not doable, all those things, just a simple piece of advice. If you think compliance is costly to you, try non-compliance. You'll understand what to be done.
Sure. डरना मना है पर compliance जरूरी है. Right.
That's a very interesting question somebody has written. Andrew, it says, is informed consent even realistic when most users do not read what they agree to? And this is a very interesting question. I mean, this is, if as a citizen, if I'm not reading to what I'm entitled to, what would I do? Or if that is informed consent is a burden of proof for fiduciaries, that's their responsibility, right? Ever sat in an exit row seat when you're enjoying the view in the large legroom, when the air hostess suddenly comes and says, open the door like this until we say evacuate? So that is their job to inform us, not our job. So in case if we ignore this, well, in case if we have to land, you find your options. So informed consent is something that definitely as a fiduciary you have to give. If the user is not reading it, they're still scrolling and signing it. I have fulfilled my obligation. I cannot go and micromanage all the data principles of the world.
Thanks, Priyank, for taking that as well. Any last words before we close, or should we just move to close? All good? Okay, so let me just take a moment to synthesize what we covered today. Consent is no longer a legal artifact. What our panelists described today is a consent capability, one that touches strategy, systems, people, as well as audit readiness. And strategy is about intent, knowing what you are trying to achieve, who owns it, and how you will defend it. Architecture is the operational test, whether you capture orchestration and downstream signal flows actually hold up. And the pitfalls, finally, are where the gap between intent and reality actually shows up, often in places where organizations do not look until it is too late. So I want to thank Abhishek, Grishmi, and Priyank for a genuinely substantive conversation today. You are some of the sharpest minds in India's privacy ecosystem. And I think everyone in this audience has walked away with something that they can act on. As the team behind ConsenPro, we will be sharing a summary of today's session and a DPDP consent readiness framework with all registrants. Watch for that in your inbox. If you would like to understand where your organization stands on its consent readiness, or if you would want to see how ConsenPro handles consent management and data discovery, our team would be happy to connect. Thank you to everyone who joined in today, and have a nice day. And thank you to the organizing team led by Meher for organizing this so seamlessly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
you, my
you.
co-panelists and
Thank you.
Mohit. Thank you very much. Have a nice time.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Thank
everybody.
you, everyone.